The GPS alarm blared with unusual insistence, cutting through the oppressive quiet of the fog that swallowed Interstate 80 on the outskirts of Sacramento, California. It was 3 a.m. a cold Thursday in November, the kind of early morning few dared to venture out, and the scent of pine and dampness was almost palpable, emanating from the surrounding forests. Raymond, in his early 40s, his face etched with the fatigue of years of night shifts as a rideshare driver, ignored the route suggested by the app. His brown eyes, usually weary, now gleamed with a sharp apprehension. He was on his way to the Line 23 bridge, a steel and concrete behemoth spanning the American River, known among locals for its neglected cracks and its reputation for having been hastily constructed. A cold stab in his stomach warned him. Suddenly, the vision, more real than anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't a dream, nor a mirage, but a vivid premonition. A dull crack, the sound of twisting metal, and the bridge contorting terrifyingly, its massive pillars giving way to internal rot caused by years of ignored infiltrations. He could feel the metallic chill of the rising cold water and the strong smell of wet concrete and mud. In his ears echoed the silenced scream of the passengers, a soul-chilling sound. A shiver ran down his spine, and the steering wheel, previously warmed by his hands, now felt like ice. This wasn't real. It couldn't be, but it felt more vivid than any recent memory. His hands, instinctively, sharply turned the wheel to the right, making a turn almost imperceptible to the others, veering off the main route. The premonition hammered in his chest, a somber and urgent warning he dared not ignore. The lives of his passengers and his own depended on that sudden detour. The fog, previously just a visual obstacle, now seemed like an omen, a veil hiding the imminent abyss. Raymond gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white, sweat trickling down his forehead and sticking a few strands of hair to his skin. The premonition had hit him with the force of a punch to the gut. The car's headlights barely pierced the mist, revealing only the first few feet of the road before everything dissolved back into an indistinguishable, depthless mass. The silence inside the car was broken only by the soft static of the radio, which Raymond kept at an almost inaudible volume. "As long as we get there before dawn." His voice was carefree, without a hint of concern, oblivious to the tension hanging in the air, and the muffled sound of tires on the wet asphalt, which sounded more like a constant whisper. He seemed oblivious to everything, lost in his own thoughts, a quiet and enigmatic figure amidst Raymond's internal chaos. Her eyes, previously closed in sleep, now showed a touch of curiosity and impatience. All right. How much longer will it take? Sharp curves emerged abruptly from the fog, and Raymond had to redouble his attention, his eyes fixed on the white line that was barely distinguishable on the asphalt. With each passing mile, the feeling of having escaped something terrible intensified, mixed with a growing apprehension. Why had he had that premonition? It looks like the car broke down. A different coldness, a premonition even darker than the bridge premonition, began to settle in his chest. He had avoided one danger, but it seemed fate, or something more, had other plans for them. The web was just beginning to be woven. And why did it feel so real, so palpable? His mind struggled to find a logical explanation, but there was none. Maybe 10 minutes extra at most. The engine warning light flashed ominously red, and the car began to lose power, sputtering as if out of breath. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Raymond's ragged breathing and the faint creak of the cooling engine, like a wounded animal. The fog seemed to close in around them, engulfing the car in a bubble of darkness and uncertainty. "Damn it," he swore, his heart pounding with renewed dread. "What's happening? This road is a bit longer, but there's no traffic. I have an early flight." The air was heavy, with a strong smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. typical of rural California on a humid autumn night. A biting chill seeped through the window cracks, despite the heater being on full blast, making Raymond's shoulders hunch slightly. A glimpse so real, he could still feel the sticky dampness in the air and the acrid smell of the river beneath, the bridge that had collapsed in his mind. He had detoured, opting for a dark, winding back road that delved deeper into the countryside, leaving behind Line 23 and imminent death. In the back seat, the quiet was almost palpable, punctuated only by the soft hum of the engine. His passenger's a young college student, Ethan, 20, with disheveled hair and colorful headphones, his face illuminated by his phone screen as he scrolled through social media. Sarah, a woman in her early 30s, wearing a wrinkled blazer and with the tired expression of someone who had just finished a long shift, her eyes closed, trying to nap. And Mr. Henderson, an elderly man in his 70s, wearing a worn baseball cap and with a gentle demeanor, who seemed to be on his way somewhere late at night, seemed oblivious to the danger they had narrowly escaped. The fog persisted, dense and oppressive, transforming the outside world into a gray, indistinct blur. Raymond tried to calm his nerves, taking deep breaths, his heart still pounding against his ribs. "Sorry about the route change," he mumbled, his voice strangely hoarse and a little strained. "I thought it would be better to take a shortcut. Traffic on the interstate must be bad at this hour because of the fog." He knew it was a flimsy lie, a fragile excuse, but he couldn't reveal the real reason. How could he explain that he had detoured because of a premonition about a collapsing bridge? They would think he was insane. Ethan, the college student, took off his headphones with a lazy sigh. "No problem, driver." Sarah, the executive, slowly opened her eyes, blinking a few times to adjust to the dim light. "Not much," Raymond replied, trying to sound as convincing as possible. Though uncertainty gnawed at his insides, Mr. Henderson simply nodded, a faint, almost imperceptible smile on his wrinkled lips. The back road, though less traveled, was treacherous. Suddenly, a sharp, grinding metallic sound reverberated from the car radio, a strange noise that belonged to no station. Raymond looked at the dashboard. The vehicle shook violently, a mechanical cough, and then stopped completely in the middle of the dark road, just a few feet from a sharp bend, enveloped by the fog that seemed to have grown even denser. "What happened?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with surprise and a hint of suppressed irritation. "I don't know," Raymond replied, trying to start the engine again, but it only groaned in protest without any sign of life. The smell of burnt oil, sour and suffocating, mingled with the earthy scent of the fog, filling the interior of the car stranded in the dense darkness. Raymond tried to start the engine again, turning the key with impotent fury, but the engine only groaned in protest, refusing to respond. The cold air of the fog seeped through the cracks, raising goosebumps on his exposed skin. An overwhelming sense of helplessness washed over him. "It won't start," he muttered, lightly hitting the steering wheel, a gesture of frustration. Anger mingled with fear, a corrosive combination. He had avoided the bridge, the first encounter with death, but now they were stranded in the middle of nowhere, vulnerable and exposed. Ethan, the college student, took off his headphones and leaned forward, curiosity mixed with a touch of impatience growing on his face. Soon, the blinding headlights of a large, rusty truck emerged from the fog, rapidly growing in size, like a monster emerging from the mist. Raymond expected the driver to see the stopped car and slow down or swerve. The truck was coming straight for them, its headlights blinding them completely, the sound of its engine and deafening roar that swallowed every other sound. And leaping out, almost tripping into the muddy ditch beside the road. There was no time for anything, no time to think, no time to react. His eyes widened, fixed on the dark, colossal mass that was relentlessly approaching. He looked at the destroyed car, the brake lights flickering faintly like a dying heart, the hood crumpled and smoking. The fear in their eyes mirrored his own. The truck ... it was gone. There wasn't even a trace of taillights in the fog, no sound of an engine moving away. It was as if it had never existed, a ghostly apparition of death. Mr. Henderson hadn't gotten out. A wave of guilt and despair washed over him, a cold weight in his chest. Death on line 23 had been avoided, but the web was tightening around them, invisible, omnipresent, and deadly. Fate, Raymond realized with a shiver, was just beginning its cruel game. He had saved the others from the bridge, only to deliver them to another form of death, more brutal and unexpected. In that instant, he realized this was the trap the Premonition had tried to warn him about. The Premonition wasn't just about the bridge, but about death itself, which seemed to relentlessly pursue them, changing forms, but not intentions. But the truck seemed to be heading straight for them at an alarming speed, with no intention of braking. Can we call someone? A tow truck maybe, or an alternative Uber. Ethan, the quickest and most agile, pushed open the back door and jumped out, falling into the muddy ditch, but unharmed. Sarah hesitated for a moment, paralyzed by dread, but the instinct for survival, stronger than fear, propelled her. She opened the passenger door and launched herself out, falling onto the damp, cold grass. Mr. Henderson, slower and frailer, was just beginning to move, his trembling hands reaching for the handle, but it was already too late. He tried to smile, but the tension was palpable. The impact was violent, pushing Raymond's vehicle several feet down the road, leaving a trail of wreckage. The sound of the collision reverberated in the darkness, followed by a disturbing silence, broken only by the dripping of fluids from the damaged engine and the sound of the survivor's ragged, irregular breathing. Sarah, who had seemed sleepy earlier, was now wide awake, her eyes wide and fixed on the impenetrable darkness beyond the window. She tried her cell phone, but the screen remained blank. "There's no signal here," she said, her voice thin and tense, a whisper of despair. "My phone has no service at all." Raymond felt a flicker of relief. Perhaps another car could help them. He turned on the car's hazard lights, whose faint beams barely managed to pierce the dense mist, appearing as small pulses in the darkness. Raymond took out his own cell phone. Nothing. The signal bar was empty, as if they were in an isolated pocket of the world. Line 23, despite being dangerous, would have had a constant flow of cars and, consequently, cell service. This back road was a silent trap, an escape route that had turned into an ambush. "Damn it," Raman hissed, frustrated, his fist clenched on the steering wheel. He could feel the passengers' gazes on him, each with their own mixture of growing concern and resignation. Mr. Henderson remained silent, his eyes fixed on an invisible point in the fog, a mute and enigmatic observer. The distant sound of an approaching engine broke the heavy, oppressive silence, a beacon of hope in the darkness. The engine sound grew louder, a deep roar that reverberated in the humid air. "He's not stopping!" Sarah screamed, her voice choked with panic, her eyes wide with terror. Raymond froze, his body paralyzed by terror, a chilling fear running through his veins. "Get out of the car!" Raymond yelled, his voice strangled by pure fear, pulling the driver's side door open. The other passengers took a second to react, too terrified to process the order. The truck hit the car with a deafening crash of twisting metal and shattering glass, a sound that echoed through the night, breaking the quiet of the fog. Raymond, huddled in the ditch, smelled the strong odor of gasoline and burning rubber, an odor of death. He looked at Ethan and Sarah, both pale and trembling, but miraculously unharmed, their figures almost ghostly in the fog. The cold now wasn't just from the weather, but from a primordial terror that seeped into his bones. The silence after the collision was more terrifying than the crash itself, a vacuum that swallowed every sound. The fog persisted, a thick, damp blanket that hid everything, and the acrid smell of burning rubber and gasoline, now more intense, mingled with the earthy, damp odor of the forest, creating an oppressive atmosphere. He leaned over the passenger seat, the crumpled door preventing a clear view. The elderly man was motionless, his worn baseball cap fallen to the car floor. There were no visible injuries, no bloodstains, but the absence of movement and the waxy pallor of his face spoke volumes. Raymond felt a lump in his throat, tears stinging his eyes. He had failed. The man he promised to take to his destination had met his end there, in the middle of nowhere. Raymond crawled out of the ditch, his body aching with a sharp pain in his left knee, his mind in a state of numb shock. "We can't stay here. It's not safe." He ran to the destroyed car, his legs trembling, hope dwindling with each step, replaced by growing despair, and now with a body in a destroyed vehicle. There must be a town or gas station nearby, right? If we go back the way we came on the main road. Fear tightened his chest, a sense of absolute helplessness. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice almost inaudible, but filled with dread. "All right," he agreed, resigned. "Let's go back the way we came. Maybe we'll find something, some inhabited place." The faint lights of the destroyed car's headlights flickered weakly behind them, a somber and constant reminder of what they had just survived and what they had lost. She pointed to the fog in front of them, where the road curved and disappeared into a white wall. His instincts were sharp, a mixture of fear and adrenaline. "We're all a bit shaken by what happened." He tried to listen, straining his ears, but there was nothing but the distant sound of a coyote howling in the night, a lonely and melancholic sound. The sound of their footsteps on the damp grass and wet asphalt was the only noise in the silent landscape, a monotonous rhythm that seemed to echo Raymond's accelerated heartbeat. The bridge Premonition had been clear, a direct warning, but the way death was reaching them was winding, unpredictable, and cruelly ironic. "Mr. Henderson?" he called, his voice choked, a lump tightening in his throat. Ethan asked, his voice hoarse with pure terror. "We can't go in that direction." Something is very wrong. He didn't need to explain what he felt. That sound was a warning, clear as a bell. A trap had been set, and they were about to fall into it. Fate was mocking them, showing them with every step that escape was futile, that every detour led them to a new dead end. The feeling of being trapped in an invisible labyrinth became overwhelming. Sarah seemed more nervous, looking back and forth at every shadow the fog created, as if expecting something to emerge from the mist at any moment. Raymond felt a tingling in his fingers, a sense of alert. It was the unmistakable sound of metal violently twisting, followed by a heavy thud, like something large falling. That metallic snap, the twisting, the destruction. It couldn't be a coincidence. Death had tried to take Mr. Henderson in another way, and now the warning repeated itself for them. The three jumped, startled, and looked in the direction of the noise. The fog prevented a clear view, but the sound was unmistakable, eerily familiar. He knew they were being watched, and the observer, he was sure, was not human. Ethan, though he tried to maintain composure and appear rational, was also visibly shaken, his eyes darting nervously into the darkness. It was a feeling that death was hot on their heels, an invisible and relentless entity, observing their every move, waiting for the right moment to strike again. His eyes scanned the fog, looking for any sign, any indication that something was wrong, anything that could reveal the next trap. The cold of dawn deepened, and the humidity of the fog clung to their skin. Ethan and Sarah approached, their eyes wide and fixed on the car's interior, reflecting the same horror and disbelief. Sarah let out a small, muffled gasp at the sight of Mr. Henderson, bringing her hands to her mouth to stifle a sob. Ethan asked, his voice an incredulous, almost inaudible whisper. Guilt crushed him, an unbearable weight. He had detoured to save lives, had had the premonition, but one of them had been cut short so brutally and unexpectedly, in a cruel twist of fate, it was as if death was correcting an error. Ethan merely shook his head, his face gray and pale, an expression of profound shock etched on his features. He's gone? Sarah asked, her voice trembling, almost tearful, looking frantically at the empty road in all directions. It was as if the truck had been an apparition, an ephemeral manifestation of death coming to claim what was its own. The cold air seemed denser, heavier, and the silence more oppressive and menacing. It just vanished, without a trace. Raymond merely nodded, unable to speak, his throat tight. Where did that truck go? Raymond also couldn't understand. No trace of light, no sound of an engine moving away, no tire marks on the wet road. We need to get out of here, Raymond said, his voice firmer than he felt, trying to mask the terror in his own chest. But where to go? They were in the middle of nowhere, on a forgotten back road, with no cell signal, no car. Let's walk, Ethan suggested, with a thread of hope in his voice, trying to find a solution. Raymond wasn't sure. That road was known for being isolated and sparsely used, but there was no other option. Staying there was even more dangerous. The three began to walk back, the fog still thick, their figures almost ghostly in the darkness. With each step, Raymond felt a growing sense of danger. It wasn't just the fear of another accident or of being attacked. Suddenly, Sarah stopped abruptly, her body tense, like a string pulled taut. Raymond and Ethan stopped, frozen, listening intently. The silence was absolute, except for Raymond's own heartbeat, which resonated in his ears like a drum. I didn't hear anything, Ethan said, a hint of uncertainty in his voice, but he also seemed tense. But Sarah shook her head, her eyes wide, fixed on a spot in the fog ahead. It sounded it sounded like a whisper. Up ahead. Raymond felt an icy shiver run down his spine. He was beginning to get used to the silent warnings that death seemed to send. It must have been your imagination, Sarah, Raymond said, trying to sound calm and reassuring, though his heart was pounding against his ribs, an erratic beat. They continued to walk, but the tension increased with each step. The fog felt colder, damper, and the smell of wet earth intensified, making the air heavy and difficult to breathe. Suddenly, a loud grating sound erupted from the middle of the forest to the left of the road, coming from a denser area of the woods. What was that? Raymond felt an icy chill run down his spine. That sound. It was the same sound he had heard in his premonition of the bridge. Let's turn back, Raymond said, his voice urgent, almost an order, pulling Sarah and Ethan by the arm. The sound of twisting metal, the echo of Raymond's premonition, reverberated in his ears, a macabre melody he had tried to silence, but which now seemed to follow his every step. Sarah asked, her voice a sharp, high-pitched whisper of terror. Her eyes, wide and frightened, scanned the gray mass of fog ahead of them, as if expecting something to emerge at any moment. He couldn't explain the premonition, not now. We need to go back. With each step, Raymond felt a growing sense that they were not alone, that something was watching them. The air seemed heavier, denser, and the fog, a character in itself, danced around them, revealing and concealing ghostly shapes. Ethan exclaimed, a ray of hope in his voice. Thank God. I thought we'd never get out of here. The web of fate seemed to be tightening around them. Nevertheless, the desperation of his passengers was palpable, and he had no choice but to move forward. With each step they took towards the light, the mist seemed to close behind them, as if sealing off the way back. Hey, maybe it's a house. We can ask for help. The smell of mold and rotten wood was strong, mixed with a strange, almost metallic aroma. The only light came from a gas lantern hanging on the porch, swaying and casting distorted shadows. The temperature seemed to drop even further, a biting cold that seemed to come from within. Let's try to go in the opposite direction. Look for the interstate. He knew it was a gamble. The road they were on was a winding serpent of curves and climbs, and the fog made every meter a dangerous adventure. She was trembling uncontrollably, her teeth chattering. Ethan called, his voice thick with uncertainty. It wasn't the bridge, but it was the same sound of destruction, of collapse, of something large and solid falling apart. "No, wait!" he shouted, but it was too late. Sarah pushed the door open and entered, followed by Ethan. Ethan knocked on the door, which echoed a hollow, disturbing sound. There was no answer. "Let's go inside. There must be a phone in there." He had witnessed the truck accident, but this sound, coming out of nowhere, seemed to destabilize him even more. With his heart pounding, he hurried to catch up with them, stepping into the damp, cold darkness of the house. The metallic smell was stronger inside, a smell he couldn't identify, but which filled him with irrational dread. The door creaked and slammed shut behind him with a heavy thud, plunging them into almost total darkness. The only light came from the faint gas lantern outside, whose rays barely reached the interior through the cracks in the door and the dusty windows. The next trap had been activated. It was something that could not be explained by logic. The smell of wet pine and damp earth was almost suffocating, and the cold of the fog seeped into his pores. He felt a knot in his stomach, a premonition that they were walking in circles, or worse, in a downward spiral. Fate would not give up so easily. It seemed to come from an old, barely visible structure. Was it a house? A barn? What the hell was that, Ryman? Ethan, for his part, was pale. He said nothing, but his eyes showed a mixture of fear and distrust. "I don't know, but it's not good," Raymond replied, pulling the two back urgently. They began to walk back, their steps hurried, the sound of their ragged breaths punctuating the silence. Suddenly, a faint flickering light appeared ahead, through the fog, like a trembling candle. A light. Sarah also looked at the light, her eyes shining with momentary relief. Raymond, however, felt a chill. That light seemed too convenient, too easy. Was it a trick? As they approached, the light revealed an old, decaying house with dark, lifeless windows, and a porch that creaked with the slightest breath of wind. "It looks abandoned," Raymond murmured, his voice hoarse, apprehension growing in his chest. His intuition screamed at him not to approach. But before he could stop them, Ethan and Sarah had already climbed the creaking wooden steps. "Is anyone there?" A sepulchral silence answered, only the wind whispering through the cracks of the house. The door, however, was ajar. "It must be unlocked," Sarah whispered, her hand already on the rusty doorknob. Raymond felt panic. Raymond hesitated for a second, his instincts screaming at him to run in the opposite direction. But he couldn't leave his passengers. The interior of the house was a dark, cold mass, permeated with the smell of mold, ancient dust, and that peculiar metallic aroma that Raymond could undecipher, but that sent a visceral chill down his spine. The darkness was almost total, and the little light filtering through the dirty windows and door cracks created distorted shadows that danced on the walls, taking on menacing forms. The door, which had slammed shut, seemed to have sealed the entrance, trapping them. "Hello?" Sarah called, her voice trembling, echoing into the void. "Is anyone here?" The sound of her voice was muffled, as if the house absorbed all sound. The metallic smell grew stronger as they delved deeper into the house, now mixed with a sweet, rancid odor that chilled Raymond's blood. "I can't see anything." Not fresh blood, but something old, clotted, mixing with the smell of rust. It was the same odor he had felt for a brief instant in his bridge premonition. His mind tried to fight this association, but it was undeniable. "Is there even electricity here?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide, fixed on the newspaper. "But ... Raymond, you got us out of there. You said the bridge ... In the center, there was a table covered with a sheet, and around it, chairs that seemed to be arranged for a macabre meeting. "Look at this," he said, his voice faltering. They're about accidents. Lots of accidents. Raymond's flashlight beam swept the room, revealing stacks of old, dusty newspapers, some of which seemed to date back decades. Not just a few, but dozens, perhaps hundreds, strangely arranged, as if they had been carefully collected. A sound that resembled shuffling footsteps, but didn't seem human. The air grew even colder, and the smell of death was overwhelming. What awaited them there, he didn't know, but he was sure that death would no longer be symbolic. He felt the presence, a cold, ancient aura, waiting for them. The final trap had been set, and they had walked willingly into it. Some appeared to be human. The metallic aroma, he realized with an icy horror, was the smell of dried blood, of decomposition. He could feel Sarah's and Ethan's apprehensive gazes on him, but they also seemed relieved by the light he carried. Ethan fumbled along the walls, searching for a light switch. Sarah asked, her voice thick with disgust and terror. The date on the newspaper was 3 days after that morning. The newspapers, they weren't escaping death. They were just postponing it, prolonging an agony, falling into traps that would lead them to the same end. It was then that he saw, in the darkest corner of the room, behind a stack of boxes, a faint reflection. He moved the light there. The bridge had really collapsed. He had saved them, yes, but the newspaper was there, irrefutable proof that the premonition had come true, despite his efforts. Guilt crushed him again. Landslide on Highway 101, 2 dead. Read one. Industrial warehouse fire, unknown victims, another stated. But one headline in particular made Raymond's heart freeze. Line 23 bridge collapse. Doubts about cause. Here it says the bridge collapse happened 3 days ago. But we were just there this morning. Raymond felt an oppression in his chest, a sense of claustrophobia that went beyond the dark environment. Sarah whispered, covering her nose with her hand. It's horrible. The premonition had not ceased. It had merely changed form, adapting, becoming more subtle, more insidious. He was in the center of a new danger, and death, he knew, was near. He fumbled in his jacket pocket, pulling out his cell phone and turning on the flashlight. The beam of light revealed a narrow, dusty corridor, with furniture covered in white sheets, like silent ghosts. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, creating an even more sinister atmosphere. The wooden floor creaked beneath their feet with every step. Let's be careful, Raymond warned, his voice low and urgent. I don't know what this place is. They slowly advanced down the corridor, the flashlight's beam revealing strange and random objects. A dusty rocking chair that seemed to move slightly on its own. An old painting with a faded face that seemed to watch them. What's that smell? Raymond didn't answer. He recognized the smell. It was the smell of blood. They reached a large room, which seemed to be the living room. Ethan, more curious, picked up one of the newspapers from the top of the stack. Raymond approached, and the beam of light from his phone illuminated the bold headlines. Line 23? Raymond couldn't speak. This doesn't make sense, Ethan mumbled, picking up another newspaper. A horrible thesis began to form in Raymond's mind. The premonition, the escape, the truck, Mr. Henderson's death. The sweet metallic smell intensified, becoming almost unbearable. Raymond swept the flashlight beam frantically. What he saw made his stomach churn. They were piles of bones. A noise, a soft drag, came from the deeper darkness of the house. What is that? Raymond didn't answer. He knew. This house was not a refuge. It was the final destination. The labyrinth had reached its center. The dragging sound, coming from the deeper darkness of the house, became more distinct, closer. It wasn't footsteps, not like a human's. It was a wet, scraping sound, like something heavy and shapeless dragging across the dusty floor. Ethan, for his part, was paralyzed with terror, his eyes fixed on the darkness. They also felt, Raymond realized, the oppressive presence that filled the air. The metallic, rancid smell intensified, a nauseating odor that burned Raymond's nostrils. He aimed his phone's flashlight at the source of the sound, his hand trembling so violently that the beam of light danced frantically on the walls. There was no touch, no explicit violence, only a sensation, an absolute cold that emanated from the figure. She tried to back away, stumbling over the scattered newspapers, but the figure moved with a ghostly speed, effortlessly. Again, the translucent hand extended towards her. Sarah fell to her knees, her body gently convulsing until the movement ceased. She lay there, lifeless, her eyes open and fixed on the ceiling, but without a glimmer. Ethan's eyes widened for an instant, a terrified recognition, and then he collapsed to the floor, without a sound, like a puppet with its strings cut. He was alone now, the last survivor, the last to be confronted by the entity. The voice resonated in his mind, cold and emotionless, but with a terrifying certainty. Only a darkness that swallowed him, a cold that penetrated his very soul. Authorities perplexed by the series of unexplained accidents that claimed his passengers. A young man hit by a driverless car on a busy street in Davis, an executive falling from a San Francisco office, building rooftop due to an unexplained railing failure, and the elderly man found lifeless in his destroyed car had no leads. Raymond's cell phone GPS was eventually located, abandoned inside the decrepit house, which was found mysteriously empty, clean, and without any trace of recent events. Upon reviewing the GPS data, police noticed a disturbing anomaly. Every path Raymond had taken, every detour, every alternative route he had chosen, all ended at the exact same point on the map. A single coordinate, the exact center of the Line 23 bridge. The abyss had exacted its price, no matter the path. The world faded, the sound of his own heartbeat silenced. Raymond was no longer there. The figure slowly turned, its eyes invisible, but its presence undeniable, focusing on Raymond. The smell of death was so strong he could barely breathe. There were no injuries, no marks, only the void. Sarah let out a muffled scream, her hands covering her mouth. The phone's light flickered, and he saw, in the last newspaper, the headline that hit him like lightning. Rideshare driver vanishes after passengers found dead in unexplained accidents. Police have no leads, and the date was the next day. All coordinates. The center of the bridge. The scene of the truck accident. That place? That was the aftermath. It was the understanding that every rescue had been just an illusion, a temporary detour to the inevitable. Raymond closed his eyes, accepting his fate. He would feel no pain, he knew, only the void. The same void he felt when the bridge collapsed in his premonition. The same void that consumed his passengers. He looked at Ethan and Sarah. They were motionless, in shock, as if life itself was being sucked from their bodies. Their eyes were empty, fixed on the nebulous figure. The premonition was not just a warning of death, but the very manifestation of death coming to claim them, in various forms, but with the same purpose. From the gloom of the adjacent hallway, a figure began to emerge. It wasn't a horror movie monster, nor a grotesque creature. It was something far more subtle and disturbing. It was a silhouette, tall, slender, ethereal. It seemed to float more than walk, without the slightest distinction of features, enveloped in a kind of dark mist that seemed to emanate from the fog outside itself. Raymond's eyes tried to focus, but the figure seemed to writhe, without a defined form, like dense smoke taking a vaguely human shape. The air grew icy cold, and the smell of damp earth and decomposition was almost overwhelming. There was no mouth to speak, but Raymond heard. Not with his ears, but with his mind. A cold, ancient voice, which was not a whisper, but a resonance in the void. You tried to deviate from the path. But fate is a river that flows to the same sea. All coordinates converge. The words chilled Raymond's blood. The ethereal figure extended a pale, almost translucent hand towards Ethan. Sarah screamed, a sharp, desperate sound that was quickly muffled by the house. Raymond felt overwhelming despair. He had tried. He had fought. But fate was relentless. Your effort was in vain, driver. Every path you tried, every detour, led to the same point. The center. The abyss. Raymond slowly retreated, bumping into one of the stacks of newspapers. He wasn't dying now. He had already died. All of them. That moment in the house. The figure. The figure advanced, not running, but floating, the dark mist twisting around it. He felt nothing. There was no touch, no pain. A few days later, news of Raymond, the rideshare driver's disappearance, spread through local Sacramento media.